Excellent. Okay, so let's get started. So welcome everyone. Welcome especially to the public. We're here for a subcommittee meeting of the RIPA board. It's the Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee. And I'm going to begin by asking each of the board members to introduce themselves. And I know we can see some folks, maybe not others. So I'm just going to invite someone to start. And then if you can see someone else you want to pass it to, that's great. Board Member Randolph, did you want to start us off?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. I'm Rich Randolph, representative for PORAC, board member. Glad to be here with all of you. Also Chief of Police, Cuesta College Police Department, San Luis Obispo. I'll pass it off to Chief Pridgett.
Thank you, Board Member Randolph. So my name is Abdul Pridgen, representing the California Police Chiefs Association, and I am the police chief here in San Leandro, California. And with that, I'll pass it over to Board Member Dewey. I pronounced it right this time.
Yep, you did good, Board Member Pridgen. Thank you. My name is Sean Dury. I'm the Commissioner of the California Highway Patrol. It is good to be with you all this morning, and I will pass it to Board Member John Dobard. Am I saying that right, sir?
Pretty close. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. John Dobard. I'm with an organization called Catalyst California. Was recently appointed by Speaker Anthony Rendon. Happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much. We have two other board members. Sheriff Bianco, Board Member Bianco, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Chad Bianco, Riverside County Sheriff, representing Cal State Sheriff's Association. And I am driving back to Riverside from Sacramento this morning, so I'm not looking down at my phone.
Okay.
I can't even tell who's on, so someone's going to have to help me for the next person.
Okay, that's great. I'll do that. And please drive safely, Member Bianco. Just listen in. And then Board Member Hawkins, would you like to introduce
Yes, good morning.
Welcome.
My name is LaWanda Hawkins. I'm in LA and I'm with the organization called Justice for Murdered Children.
Great. Thank you, LaWanda. And I'll introduce myself. I'm Board Member Lily Kajavi. I'm a professor of mathematics at Loyola Marymount University, which is in Los Angeles, and an appointee of the Attorney General's office. Thank you, everyone. So today, as usual, our first order of business is to approve minutes from our previous meeting. And so those were sent out before we gathered today, but why don't we take a moment, if those who are able to look, Board Member Bianco, please don't start reading, to take a look at, while you're driving, at the minutes. We'll take a moment, and then if someone wants to move to have us accept them, to vote on it, and then we need a second, then we'll take a vote. I'll just sit tight for a moment here. Board Member Pridgen, I saw your hand up. Did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just one minor edit. I think on page 1, the last paragraph, if you go down, I think it's the 4th line, and the sentence begins, the proposed changed, and there's an ED. I think it should read change. The proposed change would have officers select. So that's the only thing that I saw.
Yeah, that sounds like a friendly edit to me. Folks from DOJ, is there someone here who caught that we could have, if we approve the minutes, have it reflect that correction?
Yes, I got that. So we can, if the subcommittee approves the minutes, we can certainly make that change before posting them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Testing us here, checking on us.
We appreciate all friendly edits and catches that we might have missed. So thank you.
Yeah. So I move we approve the minutes.
Right. So I heard Board Member Pridgen move that we vote to approve the minutes. And do I have a second? Maybe I'll just add that I believe formally approving the minutes isn't agreeing or disagreeing. It's just approving that these are a record of our of our previous meeting. I think I saw a second from Board Member Dewey, or
I'll
was that a
second it.
question? Okay, thank
No,
you.
I'll second it. Thank you.
Okay, so let's take a vote. Can I be reminded, is this a roll call vote, or can we weigh in on this?
It can just be it doesn't have to be a member by member roll call vote. It can be a full group vote at the same time, as long as we catch any abstentions or, votes to approve or disapprove.
Okay, so can you please unmute or raise your hand if you vote first to approve the minutes? I'll say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Board Member Lawanda, aye.
Aye.
Okay, are there any
This is
votes?
Board Member.
Oh, thank you.
Board Member Dobard, I abstain.
Okay, oh yes, so first, are there any nays? Board Member Pridgen, I saw your hand up, but I think it's left over from an aye, is that correct? Okay, thank you. So I heard ayes, I heard no nays, and then I'll do abstentions again if you want, but I think Board Member Dobard, did I hear you abstain? Thank you. Thank you. And also I realize I want to give an extra welcome. Board Member Dobard is a new member of the RIPA board and in particular to the subcommittee as well. So thank you so much for joining this subcommittee. We appreciate it. Okay, so the minutes are formally approved with one abstention. And now we have next order of business. All of the subcommittees can have two co-chairs. And right now I'm a co-chair. And that means we have a position available for another co-chair. So is there anyone who'd like to be nominated? You could self-nominate, or you could be nominated by somebody else on the subcommittee to serve as a co-chair of the subcommittee. And maybe I'll add, this is a 9-member subcommittee, so not everyone here is on the hot seat to have to co-chair. Also, I know Board Member Dobard, I know you're newer to the process. I'll also add that everyone on the RIPA board is invited to, and most folks are co-chairing some committee or other, and one could in fact co-chair more than one subcommittee. Allison?
I was going to offer that for folks not to be scared away by any sort of commitment. It's more, and DOJ, will do everything to help all of you, but it would be great for Lily to have someone else to share the responsibilities with, if anyone is willing to nominate themselves or nominate someone else.
Well, we don't always have a chance to double task and look at the chat at the same time as looking at the team screen, but I thank the member of the public who posted a comment. That's right, being a co-chair would be a joy for this committee.
This is Sheriff Bianco. I'll break the moment of awkward silence, and I will volunteer for the position, and it would be a joy to work with you.
Great. Okay, so we have a self-nomination And now I'll take another but there may be more than one. Thank you, Sheriff Bianco. Others may be interested as well. So we're going to take one more minute here to see if there's anyone else who would be interested in serving as co-chair or in nominating somebody else as co-chair. Well, I'm not one of those people who's good at letting the silence sit, but we let it sit just long enough. We got one. Thank you, Sheriff Bianco. So we have a nomination. I don't know if we need to take a formal vote or how the vote, if it's an affirmation, a yay or nay vote on a specific candidate, and then whichever candidate has the most affirmations would win, or if it was a runoff. Allison, can you remind me?
Yes, so we would need a second for any nomination. Okay. And then for these, we do have to do a roll call vote.
Okay.
And then, with the majority of the vote would carry.
Okay. All right. So does anyone care to second the nomination?
Board Member LaWanda, I second it.
Okay. Thank you, LaWanda. And so we have a candidate. Sheriff Bianco, Board Member Bianco, has kindly offered to run as co-chair. And so we're going to do a roll call vote. Allison, would you like me to do the roll, or do you have a list of those present?
I can follow down the list.
Okay.
So Chief Pridgeon.
Aye.
Commissioner Dury.
Aye.
John Dobard.
Aye.
Chief Randolph.
Aye.
LaWanda Hawkins.
Aye.
Lily Kajavi.
Aye.
And Sheriff Bianco.
I guess aye.
Great.
Okay, great. The vote carries unanimously. So thank you, Sheriff Bianco, and we welcome you as co-chair of the subcommittee.
Great. Thank you, Sheriff Bianco. Because you are currently driving, I'll continue to keep an eye on the minutes here, and I'll move us forward. But thank you so much. That's excellent. So today, the bulk of our work will be getting an update from DOJ on the status of the work data analysis being done this year. And there'll be different sections to that. And I think what we might do is as you have questions or comments, we might do those as they come. That is, we don't have to wait till all of the DOJ folks have presented before we have discussion or weigh in. And so with that, can I turn it over to Department of Justice for the overview of our subcommittee work? And in particular, Kevin Walker, I see your screen came on. So do you want to lead us?
Yes. Hello, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Kevin Walker from the California Department of Justice Research Center. I'm joined today by Dr. Marshall McMunn, who is also a research associate in the Department of Justice Research Center. There he is. And so we're both going to go through a few items from the department update. So I'll get into a PowerPoint presentation here and try and get my screen share going. I'm going to turn my video off because it won't show anyways. So let me do that. And then screen share. Sorry, I have 3 monitors. It's giving me trouble. There we go. Hopefully y'all are able to see that now. And are we seeing a presentation?
Yes, I can see. Thanks,
okay.
Kevin.
And it's the view that's the full screen is the slide. Is that correct?
That's right. I see a single screen.
Cool. All right. Wonderful. So to give an overview of what we'll be providing an update on, I'll first briefly give an overview from a bird's eye view of the stop data submitted in 2022. And then I will turn the presentation over to Dr. McMunn, who will talk about some of the planned data analysis that the department is working on in support of the policy sections of this year's report. And also he'll talk about a strategy for identifying data anomalies that may be indicative of miss or underreporting within the data. And then he'll turn the presentation back over to me. And I want to bring up a couple topics, the first being alternative coding methods for the gender variable contained within the RIPA data. That doesn't have to make sense right now for everyone. I'll go through it in more detail later. And then also to get some input from the subcommittee about some proposed changes to formatting within the appendix for the 2022 data. So with that, I'll get into the first topic, which is an overview of the STOP data. So for starters, we're going to be looking at STOP data records collected in the calendar year of 2022 this year. It's the most recent data submission period. And that was the year that Wave 4 came onto the data collection effort. So that means agencies employing 333 sworn peace officers and fewer were required to begin collecting STOP data in 2022. And so that ended up with 560 agencies across the state qualifying for data collection, 535 of which reported nearly 4.6 million stops. This means that in 2022, we're going to be looking at around 1.4 million more stops than were reported in 2021, when we had 58 agencies reporting. The difference in the 535 number and the 560 number on this slide, most of those agencies that aren't reflected there within the STOP data are agencies that may employ a peace officer or peace officers, but aren't primarily tasked with law enforcement activities. So these are agencies like district attorney's offices, medical examiners' offices that may have a sworn person, but they don't routinely routinely conduct stops. And so that's the difference between those numbers. So we're dealing with more STOP data than we have in years past this year because we're looking at data collected across the entire state. So to give a view of kind of how these stops looked like as far as the demographics of individuals stopped, we'll start with the racial and ethnic distribution of individuals stopped here. For people who have read previous year's reports, this distribution will look similar, as may many of the other ones that we'll get into in future slides here. But in 2022, individuals perceived to be Hispanic or Latina were the category with the largest number of any single racial or ethnic group within the data, followed by white individuals, then Black individuals being the third most stopped group here. So if we place this distribution of individuals stopped alongside the distribution of California residents, as measured within the American Community Survey conducted by the United States Census Bureau in 2021, which is the most recent version of that file that's available at the time. We see here again, similar to previous years, that relative to the population of residents within the states, individuals perceived to be Black had the highest degree of variation as far as their representation within the STOP data. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we see that individuals perceived to be multiracial were most underrepresented within the STOP data. And the last few years' reports have had some discussion about that, in that there is some literature that suggests that perceiving others to be multiracial is not as reliable as individuals' self-perceptions about their own multiracial identity. And so we would expect to see that. That's some of that difference there is likely explained by just the difference in perception data for RIPA data collection versus self-identification of multiracial identity. But this looks similar to what we've seen in years past as far as comparisons between residential state population and the distribution of individuals stopped. Moving forward to some of the other identity characteristics of individuals stopped. Again, this year we see that cisgender men accounted for about 70% of individuals stopped, followed by cisgender women. And we'll get into the gender distribution a bit more at a later part of the presentation. And then again this year, the age distribution looks comparable to years past, with it peaking with 25 to 34 years old being the most common age group of individual who was stopped in 2022 across the state. The proportion of stopped individuals that officers perceived to be LGBT was 0.8%. This is the same proportion as we observed within the 2021 data. The proportion of individuals that were perceived to have limited English fluency was slightly more in 2022 at 4.5% of individuals stopped, relative to the 2021 data where that number was 4.1%, but still close. And getting into perceptions of disability, right? 1.4% of individuals stopped in 2022 were perceived or known to have a disability. The most common disability that officers perceived an individual to have was a mental health disability. So this is slightly, so as far as like perceptions of disability goes, 1.4% in 2022 is slightly more than in 2021, where we saw 1.1% of individuals perceived to have a disability. But the proportion of individuals perceived to have a disability in 2022 that were perceived to have a mental health disability is slightly smaller than in 2021. In 2021, 3 out of every 4 individuals perceived to have a disability were perceived to have a mental health disability. And as we can see with that second pie chart on the right, the purple section of that pie chart that shows the proportion of individuals perceived to have a disability that were perceived to have a mental health disability isn't quite 75%. So there is some difference in the distribution of disabilities perceived this year. And lastly, before I turn it over to Dr. McMunn to go into more detail surrounding some of the report-specific analyses that are planned for this year, as well as providing some examples of what those analyses are shaping up to be, I'll go over the primary reason for stop. In 2022, we saw that traffic violations accounted for 82.1% of the primary reasons for stops that occurred in that year. This is down slightly from 86.8 in 2021. However, again, this year we see that stops for traffic violations make up the vast majority of stop contexts, as they have in all years past. Just a slightly smaller proportion, but still 4 out of every 5 stops, or a little more than 4 out of every 5 stops, were stops for traffic violations throughout the state. And this year, we observed that 9.3% of stops were made in response to a call for service. So that's a brief overview, and there's far more that we have that we're working on. So I'm going to pause here and stop my screen share, I think. Let's see, stop sharing. And then I'm going to, which will allow for Marshall to take over to present on the policy focused sections of the analyses. So, or the analyses that are focused on supporting the policy sections of the report this year.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Okay, so does that screen share look good? Everyone can hear me? Okay,
yes, it's
great.
working.
So I will be covering analyses supporting the policy sections. I will be touching on 7 different areas that we're developing for this year's report. Very briefly, they are characterizing differences among stops of officers in different assignment types, use of force across RIPA stops, simple drug possession, both as a reason for stop and a result of stop, a look at RIPA data before and after an LAPD pretext policy was updated in March of 2022, stops that result in a sole resisting arrest charge, a look at field interview cards reported during RIPA stops, and a very brief look at stops of students and stops on school campuses. And so I'll just be touching on a few small components of these broader topics that we'll actually be diving into in written content. So just sort of a preview. A note on using the American Community Survey to benchmark data. In previous years, we did not have the full state's RIPA required stop data. Well, we had the full required data, but we did not have a representation of all stops within the state. This is the first year where we have that full California RIPA data. And so we can now use the statewide American Community Survey from 2021 to do some different comparisons. And so in previous years, we used this technique of looking at a particular frequency of an outcome within demographic groups. And so we would do something like take the total number of stops of perceived individuals who are Black and divide the total number of searches to get the percent of stops of individuals perceived as Black where a search occurred. And so in 2022, that was 20.6% of stops. If you compare that to the percent of individuals perceived as white who were stopped and then subsequently searched, 12.4% of stops of individuals perceived as white were searched. And so this means that 1.7 times as many searches per stop occurred for individuals who were perceived as Black. This year, we can also look at the overall stop rate. And so if we divide the total number of stops of perceived Black individuals by the total number of Black residents in the state of California, we can multiply by 100,000 to get the number of stops per 100,000 Black residents. In 2022, that was 26,850. If we do the same thing for individuals perceived as white and divide that number of stops by the number of white residents in the American Community Survey, we get 10,555 stops per 100,000 white residents. And so this means that 2.5 times as many stops per resident occurred when individuals were perceived as Black. In addition to looking at the total number of stops per capita, we can look at other outcomes of stops, such as searches. And so we can tally the number of searches of perceived Black individuals and divide that by the number of Black residents. And that ends up being 5,519 searches per 100,000 Black residents. And we can do the same thing for individuals perceived as white, tally the number of searches, divide by the number of residents, and that gives us 1,309 searches per 100,000 white residents, which is a difference of 4.2 times as many searches per resident. And that makes sense because individuals who are perceived as Black are stopped more frequently per capita. And we know from previous years and this year as well, that within those stops, searches occur more frequently when the individual is perceived as Black. So this overall disparity in the number of searches per resident is greater than either one of those independently. So just as sort of an orientation to that style of presentation, because it hasn't been a tool that's been available to us until we've had this statewide data. Looking at our first topic, we were interested in the how stops varied across officer assignment type. Overall, the vast majority of stops is this dark purple, which is our patrol stops. That's 95.4% of all stops who were officer assignment type patrol. The next most common category is other with 1.98% of stops. And the next most common category after that was gang enforcement at 1.32% of stops. The average stops per 100,000 California residents was 11,597 per resident. There were 2.3 times as many stops of individuals perceived as Black, 1.7 times as many stops as the average individuals perceived as Pacific Islander, and 1.3 times as many stops of individuals perceived as Hispanic or Latinx. All groups fell below the state. All the other groups fell below the state average for that per resident 100,000 stop rate. If we look more closely at the different assignment types and those per capita stop rates within these racial and ethnic groups, we see that patrol being 95% of the data in the top left looks like that overall distribution. And if we look at some of the others, in 9 of 10 officer assignment types, the highest per capita stop rates occur among individuals perceived as Black, Pacific Islander, or Hispanic. The largest relative collective disparity, and so the largest difference in the size of those bars, occurs in gang enforcement, where officers assigned to gang enforcement let's see, there's 23 times as many stops per resident of individuals perceived to be Black compared to individuals perceived to be white. And so that's gang enforcement there, that panel. The next section we're working on takes a closer look at use of force by different identity variables. Here we see a figure displaying the y-axis use of force incidents per 100,000 residents. And overall, there were 116,752 uses of force during RIPA reported stops in 2022. This results in 296 instances of use of force per 100,000 residents. So just sort of a benchmark for the figure. The per 100,000 resident use of force rate was highest among individuals perceived as Black at 986 instances of use of force per 100,000 residents, nearly 1 in 100 during the year of 2022. This rate was more than 3 times the statewide average per resident. Other groups with higher than average use of force incidents per 100,000 residents include Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and Latinx, and Native American. We can also look at use of force by age. And as a reminder, the statewide average is 296 per 100,000. And we see that the age group with the highest use of force instance per 100,000 was ages perceived 30 to 34 at 798 instances of use of force per 100,000 residents. This is more than 2 times the average across all California residents. All groups between 18 and 44 years perceived age had higher per capita use of force rates than average. The lowest rates occurred in individuals under the age of 15 and over the age of 65. The next area we'll touch on are stops involving simple drug possession. And this area focuses on stops that either include a reason for a stop or a result of stop for 3 health and safety codes. Those are health and safety codes 11364, which is control of substance paraphernalia, 11350A, possession of narcotic controlled substance, and 11377A, possession of controlled substance. And so this figure is displaying counts of stops that either began with a reason for stop listing one of those 3 simple drug possession charges, or stops that included one of those 3 health and safety codes as a result of stop. So the vast majority of stops in RIPA data do not involve these simple drug possessions. Here we're looking at just ones that either began that way or ended that way. In total, approximately 1.5% of stops across all RIPA data where one of these 3 offense codes was listed as a result of the stop. And so we're looking at the figure can be read from left to right with the width of each flowing line summarizing the number of stops moving between the successive categories. And so for example, drug reason for stop, there were 15,650. Those nearly entirely started as suspicion, and 5,643 of them did not result in a drug possession charge, whereas the other 10,000 or so did result in a drug possession charge. So this is sort of to track how stops that involved either a reason for stop drug possession or a result of stop drug possession, how they started and how those stops, what the primary result of those stops were. So from this figure, we can see that only 13.9% of stops that result in one of these 3 drug possession charges began as one of these 3 drug possession charges being listed as the reason for stop, and more than 1/3 of the stops that resulted in one of these possession charges were actually a traffic reason for stop. And if we look at the top reason for stop offense codes, the reason that the individual was detained, when a simple drug charge was listed as a result of stop, we can see that the #1 reason for stop that those stops were initiated for was no registration for vehicle trailer. So that's that top red bar. And then the next 2 most common were actually 2 of the drug charges. So suspicion of either possession of paraphernalia or controlled substance. Then we see another equipment violation, display of license plates wrong, failure to obey juvenile order, and then a 3rd equipment violation, bike and headlights. And so we see several of these equipment violations being among the most common reasons that an individual is stopped when these drug charges result. If we look at those top 3 offense codes among traffic reasons for stop that result in drug possession, we can look at who is being stopped for those particular offenses. And so if we look at the per capita stop rate for these different offense codes, we can see a large disparity here in the, let's see here. Among the top 3 penal code sections, we see that 100,000 residents, a larger number of individuals perceived to be Black, are stopped for all 3 offenses than other perceived racial or ethnic groups. If we particularly look at license plate violations here, there are 6.9 times as many stops per resident of perceived Black individuals compared to perceived white individuals. If we look at percent searches, we can also see that individuals are stopped for these particular equipment violations, and notice that these are exceptionally high. For reference, the average search rate for 2022 traffic stops was 6.3%. All 3 in this case are at least double this rate at 13.5, 12.8, and for bicycle light violations, there's a 39.1% rate of searches when an individual is stopped for a bicycle light violation. And that's more than 6 times the average for traffic violations more broadly. We also see a disparity in the proportion of stops with a search by racial and ethnic group, with individuals perceived as Black or multiracial having the highest rates. Looking specifically at rates of drug possession charges resulting from these particular equipment violations, we can see that when stopped for registration or license plate display, individuals perceived as Black, despite being searched more frequently than white individuals, have lower rates of drug possession charges within these stop types than most other perceived racial and ethnic identities. The next section looks at the Los Angeles Police Department's implementation of a policy requiring officers to articulate reasoning behind pretextual stops on body-worn video, and that officers should make stops for minor equipment violations or infractions when it significantly interferes with public safety. This policy went into effect March 1st, 2022. We categorize the top 100 LAPD traffic reasons for stop as either moving, the way in which the vehicle is operated, or non-moving violations, being equipment, parking, etc. These top 100 vehicle codes account for 95% of all LAPD traffic stops. In plotting the totals for moving and non-moving violations for each month, we see that they're very close in their total number between moving and non-moving until the policy went into effect, March 1st, 2022. And after the policy, we see there's a divergence in the 2 totals, with the number of stops for moving violations increasing and the number of non-moving violation stops decreasing. This change persists for the remaining 10 months of available data. The next figure compares 2 equivalent periods, March through December of 2021 and March through December of 2022, and plots the percentage change in how many stops occurred for particular vehicle code sections. And so the bars are colored by the type of violation listed. If the bar is above 0 in the top half of the graph, as many of the red bars representing moving violations are, more individuals were stopped for this offense code in March and December of 2022 than a similar time period in the year of 2021. If the bar is below 0, as many of the teal bars are, representing equipment violations, less people were stopped for those specific offense code violations. And so we see this strong divergence in the composition of the reasons for stop within traffic of the Los Angeles Police Department after this policy was implemented. Briefly, I'll touch on our next area, which is when the Penal Code 148A1 is the sole charge resulting from a stop. There were 4,575 stops that only listed that particular penal code as the result of stop. This represents 0.1% of all stops. If we compare perceived racial and ethnic groups and the number of sole resisting arrest charges per 100,000 residents, we see a higher number of incidents per capita among individuals perceived as Black and Native American compared to other racial and ethnic groups. In particular, there are more than 4 times as many stops resulting in sole charge resisting arrest per resident for individuals perceived as Black compared to individuals perceived as white. Our second to last area of focus is on the topic of field interview cards. Field interview cards are listed as a result of stop, yes or no, by officers for each stop reported. Individuals perceived as Black have field interview cards filled out at a rate of 3 times higher per resident than any other racial or ethnic group, and 6.4 times higher per resident than individuals perceived as white. And just a very brief summary here, stops of students. These are the top reasons for stop for the offense codes listed for suspicion among students, just to get a sense of why students might be stopped for suspicion charges. And it's largely possession of marijuana, and then possession of weapon and several battery charges are among the reasons of stop suspicion among students. And then I'll briefly describe some efforts that are ongoing at the DOJ to identify data anomalies. These include looking at agency calendar completeness. And so which submitting agencies are missing entire months of RIPA data, and which specific agencies have highly variable monthly totals, amounts of variation that we would not necessarily expect. And we're also looking at data fields that have unexpected patterns by agency. And this includes specific citation codes that we see at very high frequencies, such as local ordinance violations or code not found in table, perception of all 7 racial and ethnic categories within single individuals, the field of stop duration, which should be reported as the number of minutes the stop lasted, but we've identified several likely mistaken entry types, including officers reporting the time of stop as the duration in minutes, and looking at outlier agencies in the frequency of field interview cards, curbside detentions, patrol car detentions, and physical/vehicle contact that could be the result of misunderstanding of RIPA regulations. And so that's all I had. And so it'll be back to Kevin.
Thank you, Marshall. So I can get back into the PowerPoint and continue on with the updates. I know that Board Member Kajavi, that you had mentioned that maybe throughout, if people had comments from the board, that we could pause for those to happen around the time when the information was presented. So we've done a bit of presenting on some planned data analyses. Might this be a good time to pause, or if we wanted to save everything for later, we can?
Well, there's a lot here. So, and I don't know if as folks have been looking at the data, if it's prompted some questions. So this is giving us a window into what can be done in this year's report, given the statewide data and given what DOJ analysts have been tasked with to look at. And so can I ask, is there anyone on the board who had any comments or questions at this time? Board Member Randolph, I saw your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for excellent presentation, and Doctor, excellent presentation. I just had some basic questions, a lot of data thrown at us. So thank you, Ms. Kajabi, for breaking it down for us instead of us powering through, because a lot of numbers and graphs were thrown out at people. So I didn't want to speed through a lot of data here. I just had some basic questions. So this was 2021 and 2022. I see the comparison. Is that correct, Kevin? 2021, 2022 RIPA data?
So I mentioned 2021 data a few times throughout there, just as like introducing the categories of data and where where distributions might differ or be similar. But as far as like the information that was presented on most of those slides, that's looking just at 2022 data, bar for, I think, a slide where Marshall was showing a change in traffic stops by Los Angeles Police Department between 2021 and 2022. That was showing 2 years of data.
That's the only 2021 data I had was LAPD.
So Dr. McMahon, you weren't comparing 2021 and 2022 data. That's what.
No, only in that one slide. I can reshare. Only in the one slide, looking at LAPD, data, the particular offense codes that
Okay.
increased or decreased before and after this pretext policy. And then this LAPD only figure, which includes both 2021 and 2022. Everything else was entirely 2022 RIPA data.
Can you go back on some of your slides, just like the original ones that I saw right when you started? I noticed there were some No. Okay, here the benchmarks. So this is not 2022 compared to 2021 RIPA data?
This is 2022 RIPA data, and this is the most recent 5-year American Community Survey data, which is state of California demographic data from 2021.
So we're not comparing RIPA data 2021 and 2022. That's what there was some great information.
Correct.
I just wanted to see.
Correct.
Okay, so can you forward to some of your graphs right here? There were some graphs I saw right here. So
Yep.
there's none of this we're not comparing any of these at all, 2021, 2022?
No, this is exclusively the stops per 100,000 residents for these perceived groups, all for 2022.
Is there a way we can start producing data comparing first of all, have all agencies, Kevin, I could have swore you said that wave 4 is completed. So 2022, all RIPA data for 2022 is in you guys' hands, correct?
Yes, 2022
Okay.
was the first year for which all agencies across the state collected.
I love it. We were a part of it. Okay. And that wave was 560 agencies, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So we're not going to be comparing 2022 to 2021, right? Because 2021 was only 58 agencies. Now we're up to 506 agencies, correct?
Right. So a few of my slides, I mentioned what the distributions looked like in the 2021 data because they looked similar to 2022, but we're not comparing like stop totals, et cetera, across years because of the large difference in the sections of the state that we're collecting.
Got it. Okay. And then the next one I was curious about for both of you. So 560 agencies have reported, 560 agencies were wave 4, 535. So we're missing about 25 agencies. Are any of those 25 agencies a part of the big 11? Like I'm talking 1,000 officers, 700,
no.
600.
No.
So we have no big
those,
dumps that are still owed, correct?
No, the agencies that were not part of that 535 number were the smaller agencies that employed, maybe a peace officer, like medical examiners, things like that.
Okay, and then thank you for that. And the last question I had for you guys on the uses of force, did you guys take into consideration looking at the use of force continuum? And I have other chiefs. I have the sheriff on here too. One thing I just wanted to clarify and just make sure that the board knows uses of force. So that does not mean everyone put hands on everyone. Does that make sense? I mean, a use of force for us in the majority of law enforcement is pulling your handgun out and doing a high-risk traffic stop or going into a house that is vacant where there's occupants there. So that is a part of the use of force continuum, which is what those numbers, I just want people that are not peace officers to understand. Pulling out your firearm for your safety as you clear a house or clear a vehicle, that's considered a use of force. I just want to make sure people knew about that. But thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you, Ms. Kajawa, for allowing me to ask questions.
Thank you, Board Member Randolph. Are there other folks who have questions? Now we have a window into what the data is looking like across the entire state. And of course, the RIPA report we won't just see an array of slides, but this is to get us an early look in. Board Member Pridgen, I saw your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Just one question, Kevin. So there were 500 odd agencies that were required to report. Did all of them submit their RIPA data by the deadline?
500. So you're talking about submissions by the April 1st date?
Yes.
I know that there were this being the first year that 400 some odd of these agencies were collecting for the first time. I do believe that there were some hiccups there, but the research center is not directly involved in the collection of the data with the agencies, so I'm not primed to talk about specifics with that. I don't know if we have anyone from the client services program on this call today. Sorry, I'm looking at the participant list. It doesn't look like we do.
Curious. I doubt it, but I was just curious. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
And sorry to interrupt. This is
Oh,
Erin.
I missed you, Erin. I missed you, Erin.
Oh,
I
it's
didn't see you
okay.
on there. Sorry.
No, it's all good. I didn't want to interrupt, and I don't know how much detail we want to provide at this time, but kind of as Marshall alluded to, there are some anomalies, potential anomalies that we're looking into, and there were a few instances where agencies proactively let us know that they may have encountered like a technical challenge or something like that that caused them to get to a little bit of a slower start. So I think there is going to be some of that information to kind of caveat some of the numbers in the board report. But for the most part, we were in touch with everyone. And that group of agencies where you see the discrepancy between like the 530 something and the 560, those approximately 30 agencies are ones that have been in touch with us and let us know that they don't actually expect to report stops. But they're technically would be subject to RIPA reporting requirements if they did conduct a stop. So in the latest version of the amended regulations from last August, there's a provision that requires those 0 reporting agencies to still be in touch with us. So we've kind of closed them out for 2022.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Yeah, so it's a huge undertaking, this being the first year, especially for smaller agencies to take this on. Kevin and Marshall, I had a quick question on the type of stop. This is one of the first slides, Marshall, that you had. You noted that the patrol is the vast, by leaps and bounds, the most common type of stop. So this is one of the very first. Here we go. Thank you. And I was just wondering, you had mentioned other was the next. I know these other categories are much smaller, but I was wondering if you or folks in law enforcement, just to give the rest of us a picture in, what kinds of stops or officer assignment type might not fall into rather these categories. So patrol being the dominant category, but I see lots of others. I see you mentioned gang enforcement in particular, Marshall, and then these other more specialized units. But does anything come to mind so we can get a window into other?
I have little insight as to what that would actually mean. I'm sure any of the law enforcement professionals on the board could much better address that question.
So I don't know how well folks can see the categories. I'm just asking, like, are there categories that come to mind of officer assignment type that don't fall into these? So patrol. Can you read off some of the others, Marshall? Gang enforcement was also, although a small
yeah,
fraction.
Of course. They are gang enforcement, other investigative/detective, narcotics/vice, task force, K through 12 public school, special events, roadblock or DUI, and compliance check.
And I would just assume that other would include traffic. So large agencies like LAPD, LA Sheriff's Department, they have really robust traffic departments, and all they do is conduct traffic stops to gain compliance, motorist compliance through education or enforcement. So they make a significant number of stops. And so my only assumption, since that's not a separate category, because not every department in California has a traffic division, that it would be included in other.
And since you mentioned that could be the vast majority of all of these stops that we're looking at, no matter how you slice it, are traffic stops. I wonder if that's placed under patrol in this taxonomy, because you're right, that would be a large number of stops. Kevin, I saw you unmute also.
Yeah, I'm looking at the regulations. So these are abbreviated descriptors here being displayed on the slide. When I look at the regulations, and I'm looking at the revised version, so the most up-to-date one, the patrol category is described as patrol, traffic enforcement, field operations. So it's a larger umbrella than the labeling on this chart will allow for, but patrol should include traffic enforcement.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Makes sense. So I guess what I'm really wondering is if it turns out other predominantly includes a specific category, that would be useful to know. Maybe other is in fact a lot of loose strands, that it's lots of types that are much less frequent than any of these. But it might be useful, or in the report, to say something about what the category of other is. And looking ahead to the report, on many of these slides, it's hard to always include the numbers themselves. Maybe we have some percent or fraction, and we're looking at variation, and we don't want to muddy it with too many additional numbers. But I think for some of them, knowing what the overall rate or the overall number is useful for perspective. Maybe a good example is on the very next slide, which I think was force. If we looked at use of force. Oh, yes, here. I heard you mention, Marshall, I heard you verbally say it was something close to 300, maybe 296 per 100,000. And, when we look at these bars, we can see right away the disparities between groups, but in the report, it can be useful. And maybe this was already planned, and probably was, to include the overall. Yeah,
that's great. I could put a line across and label it as, statewide average.
It might be for some of these graphs, if it's easy enough to add the line, or it might be that in the narrative just gives us perspective for how policing is impacting different groups. Are there cases where in California the overall use of force rates also, what are they relative to the national average? Maybe they're higher, maybe they're lower. So we're getting two things from that kind of data. The overall rate, we're getting a view into what the experience of policing is and law enforcement is in California for all residents, and then also their relative use of force, which of course this bar graph is capturing, but knowing the overall numbers is helpful too, especially because for some of the categorizations also, there are far more or far fewer people in the different categories. So having some of the numbers, the overall numbers, is useful too. Are there other folks who had comments or questions? Again, this is our first look in, but it gives us a sense of also the scale of data crunching that's happening. Sheriff Dury, Board Member Dury, do you want to go ahead? I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to weigh in on the possible explanation for the other.
Okay.
For us, I know we have nearly 2 million enforcement contacts a year. The majority of those are going to be patrol, but I think a possible explanation might be the commercial inspections we do, and seeing that compliance checks is so small. Possibly we're logging. We have almost 500,000 commercial vehicle inspections at our facilities, and maybe that's accounting for some of the other.
Right, thank you for that. So if commercial inspections become part of this collection, and it makes a lot of sense, CHP is very large. So anything that's happening through CHP, that is the number of stops, would show up sort of visibly in the data, so to speak. Thank you for sharing that. Other comments about what we've seen so far, or questions?
Dr. Kajabi, I had one more question. Do calls for service fall under the category of patrol? I was looking at some of the stops here, and like a call for service, I go to a call and I'm dealing with my call, and then I have contact with someone else, which was not a call for service, and now it gets entered. So I just wanted to see if we could break that down, because I think some of those contacts are going to be added to those numbers. So I was curious for Kevin, if you or Doctor could clarify, do calls for service fall under the category of patrol?
Yeah, so there are two separate variables within the data collection effort. So an officer will indicate the assignment type that they were working at the time when they conducted the stop that they're entering data for. And so that's one variable that's collected, and that's what we were looking at on that slide that Dr. McMahon was showing a moment ago. Those are the different assignment types that are available for the officer to indicate. And then separately, for each stop that they make, they'll also indicate, independent of their assignment type, whether or not the stop was initiated in response to a call for service. And so it's two variables. And so a member or an officer who's working patrol who responds to a call for service will indicate their officer assignment type, patrol. And then when they'll click the box for this was in response to a call for service. The same thing could be said of an officer who's working like on a task force of some sort or something like that. If they're responding to a call for service, they would indicate that they made that stop in response to a call for service.
Thank you. Great. So who is next on deck for us for presenting? And also we're going to keep a little eye on the time as there are questions or comments in the chat that we'll also have built in time for public comments.
So as far as next DOJ update topic, that would be me. So I'm going to reshare my screen.
Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Share up here and go full screen. Okay. So the next, and I have two topics here remaining to provide an update on. This first one is covering the topic of alternative coding methods for the gender variable, and I'll kind of walk us through what I'm talking about. And I'll note here at the beginning that this is not a proposal to change anything about what's been done in the past or what we've displayed thus far, but more so offering y'all information in the event that you'd like to take a different approach than what we've done in the past. And so there doesn't need to be action on this, but we are putting this information in front of the subcommittee in the event that the subcommittee would like to take some sort of alternative action here. And then after this, I'll go over a proposed appendix update where we are proposing to change something. And so we would like your input on that. So to start out with this, as a refresher, earlier I showed a gender distribution chart for stopped individuals in the 2022 data. So here that chart is again, except for this time it's taken out to 2 decimal places. And what we're going to be focusing on in this section of the update is this category on the right of gender nonconforming. I'll note that this category on the gender variable was changed in the most recent updates to the regulations that were passed last year, but those updates go into effect at the beginning of 2024. So this group, this category is no longer going to be continuing past the end of this year and will be replaced by a category called non-binary. But within the 2022 data, this is a category that we have, and it will be for the 2023 data as well. And so within the version of the regulations that was relevant at the time when the data were collected, here's the definition taken from the regulations of gender nonconforming. And I've highlighted this last part of this definition here because it is what leads to this discussion today. And it says, an officer may select gender nonconforming in addition to any of the other gender data values, if applicable. So here's an example screen of, and this, not every agency uses the DOJ hosted web application for collecting the data. Some of them have custom tools, but this is just an example of what it might look like when an officer is collecting the data, right? And up here, I've put a green rectangle around the gender section. So you'll notice here under gender nonconforming, there's a note that says can be selected alone or with one other value. So an officer who perceived someone to be gender nonconforming could select gender nonconforming and that's it, or they could select gender nonconforming and select one of these other values in combination with gender nonconforming. And what this leads to is if we look on this slide, and I'm not expecting y'all to do the math, but if we were to count the number of times that officers indicated each of these gender categories within the 2022 data, the sum of those that count would be higher than the number of individuals that officers stopped. So those two numbers are shown at the bottom of the slide here, 4,580,000 as compared to 4 million. So that's the number of gender perception categories, and then the number of stopped individuals is more around 4,575,000. So this is because, so we're counting individuals multiple times if we were to just go and run the analyses based off of the multiple selects there. So there were 10,533 individuals whom officers perceived to be gender nonconforming. Of these individuals, 4,505 also had another gender perception category selected. So here is the distribution of what those other selections were when officers perceived someone to be gender nonconforming. we can see here that nearly half of the time, the officer also indicated that they perceived the person to be cisgender man. Then the next most common was cisgender woman, followed by transgender man, followed by transgender woman. But here we can see that within each of these other gender categories, the proportion of individuals within that group that were perceived to be gender nonconforming varies substantially. For people perceived to be a cisgender man or woman, all right, that's roughly 1 in 1,000 stops where officers perceive the person to be gender nonconforming, whereas when officers perceive the person to be a transgender man, that's roughly 1 in 6 stops, or transgender woman, roughly 1 in 10 stops. So it's not evenly distributed there. And so in the past, in order to avoid double counting individuals when running data analyses, what we've done is when the officer indicated that they perceived a person to be gender nonconforming, we've defaulted to that gender category when running the analyses so that we're not comparing a person to themselves in another category. And so here's what that distribution looks like if we were to take that approach moving forward, right? 10,533 times were the number of times when officers indicated that they perceived the person to be gender nonconforming, and all of those are categorized in that group.
Kevin?
This is not, yes.
Kevin, so you're saying one approach is if gender nonconforming, if multiple boxes are checked off, including gender nonconforming, then you counted that individual under gender nonconforming and didn't double count them, if you will, in another category. Is that what you
Correct.
said, that you preserve gender nonconforming as opposed
Correct.
to, let's say, putting them back? Okay.
Yes. And so this next slide shows alternatives to that approach, right? The leftmost column shows the distribution of the gender category, of the gender variable, if we were to continue with that approach, right? So you see that there's 10,533 gender nonconforming individuals here. We're not double counting them anywhere. There's another alternative here in the second column, which would be to default to the other selection in the cases where officers indicated gender nonconforming in combination with another selection. So you can see here that that reduces the proportion of stopped individuals who we'd be counting under the gender nonconforming category by 0.1, but that's nearly half of the individuals whom officers perceive to be gender nonconforming, with the majority of those cases then being captured under the cisgender categories, as we saw before. But also distributing some of those to the transgender categories as well. And then there's a second alternative here that's given where we would default to the transgender category if the officer indicated that they perceive the person to be transgender and gender nonconforming. But if they perceive the person to be just gender nonconforming, right, then they would receive the value of gender nonconforming, or if they perceive the person to be one of the cisgender categories and gender nonconforming, we would capture them as gender nonconforming. So again, we're avoiding double counting individuals within the data under all three of these methods for coding this variable, but we are categorizing different rows of data in different categories under these three different sets of assumptions here. And so, as you can see, though, for the most part, the effect on the distributions here outside of the gender nonconforming category aren't affected very much. After all, it is 1 in 1,000 stops that we're actually talking about where this decision even comes into play. And so it's not going to change gender distributions very much overall, right? But it is something that we did want to, now that we have all wave 4 agencies that have come on and we're looking at the entire state, revisit with the subcommittee in the event that there was a desire to take an alternative approach to coding this variable when we're running the analyses to include in the report. So again, we're not proposing that we change anything, but we wanted to bring this up as a topic of discussion in the event that the subcommittee did want to make some changes to how we treat these cases where there are multiple selections on this variable. So I can leave this slide up here. I don't know if I think that it would be helpful if we had the discussion before I got into the next update. Yeah. So I can leave the slide up or I can take it down.
Are there any comments? Thoughts, questions from board members? or clarifications wanted? Well, maybe I'll just say something very general, which is, Kevin, what you just commented on, I think, is that the vast majority of stops made in the state of California are of cisgender men and then cisgender women. And so the whatever overall trends, the things that we learn from the data analysis are not fundamentally altered when we're looking at the state overall by how you decide to resolve this. And so it seems to me that the question would be if there's some aspect of the data where you're looking much more explicitly at the experiences of non-gender conforming folks, whether they were placed into any of these various, the trans or gender non-conforming category. It might be that if you do something where you're looking at all of the non-cisgender stops, then it does make sense to, you might decide based on what, so if you're analyzing non-cisgender stops there, that it's actually makes sense to do more than one analysis of the data. So you don't, that is, do it both ways. You have these three columns. And I don't have an insight under when it might be most appropriate to do one or the other of the various columns that you had offhand. But just that everyone remains reassured that this isn't going to, undermine any of the overall analyses, how this categorization is made. And then secondly, that we want to do categorizations that are really respectful, of course, of the people who are being stopped and of the officers. And so, maybe not to lose the fact that some folks have been perceived as gender nonconforming or not. And so, but again, it may depend on the particular questions, particular sort of sub-analysis that you're doing. This becomes more relevant. So this isn't resolving the question at all. I think what I'm saying is it's valid to look at it in any of the three ways that you did, and you might decide further along at some point, depending on what you're breaking down data-wise using these categories, that it makes sense to focus on one versus the other of the columns. Did anyone have any additional thoughts or comments about this? And I appreciate. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Oh no. I was just going to say, hearing none, I do find that bit of feedback that you have for us helpful. I mean, we can kind of revisit this and see how, if we were to take some of those alternative approaches to coding the gender variable, if we're doing analyses that are very specific to looking at some of these gender categories, right? We could run them multiple ways to ensure that a particular coding method of this variable doesn't have very large differences in the results that we're seeing from what we normally take and what we've taken in past reports. So I think that we could take that as a potential approach, and that sort of feedback is helpful for us.
Yeah, because we don't want to somehow obscure the experience of gender nonconforming folks in the state of California, and on the other hand, I don't want people to worry if it sounds like, oh, is there an ambiguity about how to code, does that somehow undermine the whole process? No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Right. I mean, we are talking about 1 in 1,000 stops on one variable here, right? And so, yes. Okay, that is helpful. Thank you. I appreciate your input on that, and we can keep that under consideration moving forward. So I have a couple more slides that just talk about.
Let's go to, yeah.
Yeah. Great. All right, let me pull up my presentation again. Okay, appendix changes. So what I'd like to go over with y'all is a proposal to change some of the formatting within the appendix for this upcoming year's report. Specifically, I'm going to provide a couple examples here on this slide. Well, before I get into it, this next slide is an example. I don't expect y'all to be able to read the numbers. I get that it's blurry. These are screenshots of 2 pages from last year's appendix, section C. And what's important that you be able to see here is that on the left page in that first column, we have 3 agencies that are displaying per page on this table. And then on the right page there are 8 agencies displaying per page in that table. These are both tables taken from Appendix C. Last year, Appendix C was 49 pages in total for 58 agencies, but with over 500 agencies collecting this year, that would mean that this appendix section would be about 450 or so pages long if we were to put this in a PDF document and format it the same way that we have in years past. Obviously, that's an extremely long appendix, and this is only one appendix out of that document. And so it's just a PDF document of that size might not be something that might be a file size that you might not be able to actually email to someone else and share, depending on the email service providers, et cetera. They sometimes have file size limits. So we would potentially run into issues like that might affect the reach of the report. Not to mention, it's going to be very difficult for someone who's scrolling through this appendix or flipping through, if they decided to print out an appendix of this size, to find particular agencies that they're looking for within this. And so we've encountered this sort of issue before in the past. So on this page, I'm showing another appendix table, this time taken from the 2020 report. And this table was in the appendix for that year's report for the board, and it just shows the gender distribution of individuals stopped by agencies. And so for the 2020 report, we only had 8 agencies that reported data in 2018. And so these tables could fit in a PDF document neatly because they're about 1 per page, because there's only 8 agencies. However, on the right here, we see an Excel document that shows the same information, but how it looked like for last year's report, where there were 58 agencies. And as you can see, it's been exported instead as an Excel document so that it does not take up nearly as much space within the appendix. And it has the added benefit of, one, being a smaller file size so that it could be shared via email, et cetera. And 2, it can be filtered. So if someone wanted to filter to a particular set of agencies, they could go through and type those agencies' names in the search function, filter to those and only display that, and then get the appendix content that they wanted for those agencies without having to turn pages, et cetera. Or alternatively, they could go through and look for particular counts within the data if they wanted to see locales that had particular trends within their data. That's doable using an Excel document, whereas in a PDF document, that's not an option. And so given that we're going to have appendix content this year, where we might be breaking it down by over 500 agencies, it would be difficult to do this with a PDF. And so we're hoping that the subcommittee would be all right with where there are tables where we're looking to produce that content at the agency level, that we, instead of trying to fit those in the normal appendix that's a PDF document where a single page, a single table may take up 170 pages if we were to do it that way. If we could export those as Excel documents or an Excel document that would contain different tabs, as we can see here on the right, with different tables in it that would allow for those functionalities that I mentioned earlier, like filtering. So I wanted to propose that as a potential way to address this issue of there being 500 plus agencies that are going to be displayed in the same table in many places within the appendix, in the event that you all would be all right with exporting these differently this year. So that was the question in the proposal for discussion by the subcommittee.
Does anyone want to weigh in? Can I start us off? First of all, the data collection and the analysis represents a huge effort on the part of law enforcement agencies, effort on the part of DOJ to analyze, and so and the intention isn't in the end to produce hundreds of pages of appendices that don't end up being so functional. And so the sort of the guiding principle, Kevin, that you and the others could follow is what you think has the most usability, accessibility, transparency, that the data is visible, and clarity. And I think what you're trying to tell us loud and clear is that the 400 plus page appendix doesn't meet the mark on those. It fails on those categories. And just for So if that, to me, that could be your guide, whatever you come up with that you think is the most accessible and transparent and clear and usable. And so maybe that means an Excel file. Maybe it means a CSV file also, that is a non-Excel, but just a comma delineated file, one of each. And to me, that would pass the smell test of being relative to folks who want to look at the data, accessible, without muddying things by just having them be so many PDF pages. And if you think it's useful to have a PDF that explains, have an appendix explanation or sample shot that's a couple pages, might be useful too. So it isn't just yeah.
Yeah, the board has, in that example that I used where the board had went from doing the appendix in a PDF to creating some of the tables in an Excel document, there is an accompanying PDF that explains what tabs within that Excel document are displaying what information. So there's already precedent for that as well, and that would be the plan if we were to move towards this format, to have a document that would explain where to find what.
So I don't know if others on the board have some explicit comments or concerns or interests. I'm going to guess that I'm trying to read the room, that no one here is saying, no, I really want you to have 400 plus pages of appendix. But, this is we're also creating something that's, part of public record, if you will. So folks have some additional suggestions. It's valuable to hear them. Okay. Kevin, was this the last section of the main presentation pieces? I had one question about one more item then before we move on. Marshall, you had mentioned the errors in reporting or data anomalies, missing data. And I think I heard you give as a concrete example that stop duration is a little entry point in this reporting process where some agencies are either not using a consistent method, or officers may not have clear instruction. They may have put in the time of stop, I heard you mention, instead of the duration. And I just wanted to flag that we're also very concerned with larger questions of integrity of data. So so it sounds like that sort of anomaly you're describing is really one of our learning how to, folks learning how to fill out the form, but that we're also, as a board, interested in knowing about the overall, the consistency of the data, or if it turns out there were data that was missing. And I didn't hear you raise any specific area of concern, but I just want to put that on our radar as a topic of, this is always going to be a topic of interest, not only this year, but down the road. And in particular, in past years, there were some specific categories around use of force, where there were distinctions between what was being reported through the RIPA process and then other forms of data collection. And so I hope that DOJ, there's also going to be attention to this and maybe suggestions for the board for ways that we could think about, assessing the overall veracity of the data. And I'm not sure that we can open a full discussion. We're having a full discussion about this now, but I just wanted, since the issue of data anomalies was mentioned, I want to make sure that's always on a point of attention too. So Marshall, I don't know if you want me to respond, but I just wanted to put that out there.
And I don't know, I'm already on video. So yeah, I mean the idea. Sorry, I'm not Marshall. This is Kevin, but I'll field that question. So yes, we're looking into those areas. That was a specific example of something that we had come across in our previous analyses of the data, where we observed that there were some trends in that district. It's actually a really we've got some really interesting stuff on that shows kind of where we suspect that there are some misunderstandings from a small proportion of officers who may be concentrated in specific agencies, but not fully. It's not fully particular agencies for that example, where they may be misunderstanding how to enter in duration of stop. And so this is an example, but in how we might be able to incorporate what we learn by looking at the data into the board's report. is something that I think that we're going to be, as we delve more into those explorations and examinations for anomalies, what we're going to be seeking some feedback from the subcommittee on is when we identify these areas, right, where we think that there are potential issues, how would you all like that reflected in your report? And what content should we be working to put alongside of that discussion? So that is coming down the line, and it's something that we're engaged in currently.
Okay. I also see a hand up, board member, now co-chair Bianco, and I trust you're not driving. You've pulled over. Okay. Do you want to unmute if you're able to?
No, but I'm talking, and it's hopefully you can hear me now. And I'm still driving, but I'm not going to look at my phone. It's put away. Anyway, kind of along the lines of what you're saying about the data anomalies and everything else. And I apologize, as everyone's aware, I'm newer to this, so this may have been covered before. But since we're talking about anomalies and with DOJ and the statistics part of it, and then even your comment to the accuracy or the veracity of the data that we're getting. I just have a question this is really for the people compiling the data and coming up with the data and the anomalies and even finding them. And I do appreciate the gender ones of you trying to figure out how you can explain it away. So this kind of goes with that also. So as a basic knowledge of Statistics 101, I'm wondering if there is ever going to be any effort on the part of the RIPA board or us trying to get the best information. Are we ever going to actually determine for correct numbers who is actually driving? Because my knowledge of Statistics 101, I mean, it's a huge red flag to say we're breaking down all this data of stops, but we're going to compare it to the entire population, because that right there, that tells you that's not good data, because the entire population doesn't drive and they're not on the roadway. So I'm just curious if we are ever, we're always coming up with new things that we have to add and new drop down menus and everything else. But are we going to try and come up with something about who's actually on the road that we're stopping? Because it certainly isn't the entire population to come up with these 1 per thousands and whatever it is we're doing.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a question about identifying drivers within the data and distinguishing them from other people who are stopped who are not operating vehicles.
No.
No.
The entire population of California doesn't drive. So why are we including the entire population when we're trying to come up with who are the people being stopped? That's the question. I mean, and then I'm even going, statistics class shows you that you can't compare one demographic to another demographic if they're not equal. And the driving demographic is not equal to the total population. So it's going to give you a faulty outcome. But even, I will say that as a law enforcement officer that works in certain areas, the driving population is a guarantee of what the living population is. So and what I mean by that is the population of a city is not representative of the population or of the demographics of the people driving through that city, whether they're going to work or whatever the case may be. So the question is there ever going to be an effort to determine the breakdown of the demographics of people that are driving rather than the entire population? Because the entire population doesn't drive on our roadways. So using them as the denominator is faulty.
I see. So it's the comparison data that we're talking about, not the data collected under RIPA. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, well, there have been studies where for particular locations, right, we're talking about smaller jurisdictions where they've attempted to take surveys of what the driving population looks like through observation. So there are studies like that exist that have had the luxury of being able to do that and having the staffing to do those sorts of things. But we are looking at data from throughout the entire state of California. And that would be an extremely large data collection effort that would be separate from the collection of stop data. So the resourcing there would be difficult. And then sounds like Marshall also has a point there.
I would just add, the statistics we're reporting aren't intended to be interpreted as the number of stops per driving trip or per active driver. They're simply a reflection of the number of stops that occur within the state per a number of residents within a group. And that goes for the number of stops, but also things like the number of searches per resident. Those things aren't dependent on whether or not that person's engaged in driving. You may or may not expect people who are active drivers to encounter police officers at different rates, but I guess I don't think it affects the validity of a statistic reporting something like the number of searches that occur per 100,000 residents within a group, to try to differentiate whether or not the group has more or less active drivers.
I mean, this is part of much larger question in analyzing not just these aren't just traffic stops, of course, so we're not looking at data just for drivers, but in this area in general, in every state, in many cities, that what the appropriate benchmark is. That is, you have some pool of stops, what do you compare them to? And I want to say that the measures that we have, or that the measure of comparing to residents, it's not the end of the story. It's just one way to get some perspective. And I've seen scholars both, I don't know, and politically on the left and on the right, start with that, but then go on from there. And maybe the one thing I'll say is, if we saw a perfect alignment between the fraction of driver stops and the fraction of residents of California in each of these racial and ethnic groups, maybe our story would end sooner, but it doesn't. And so our goal is to understand better what's happening through the stops and what kind of stops are being made. And in particular, to speak to your concern, I don't want you to think that this measure that Marshall started us off with is this somehow the beginning and end of the data analysis. There's much more to do there. And again, the stops themselves aren't only of traffic stops. For CHP, obviously, I'm assuming the dominant fraction of stops would be driver stops. But this is something to be mindful throughout all the analysis. What are the appropriate benchmarks? And that's one reason we saw also, in particular, Marshall, I saw you pivot then to saying when there is a stop, what fraction of pedestrians and drivers stopped or searched, for example, out of stops. So that's not in reference to the population of California. That said, this is the first year we have data that's completely statewide. And so it's appropriate to see, okay, how does this actually reflect what the population of California looks like overall? But I appreciate, thank you for sharing that point. Yes, Kevin?
And just one thing I'll note is that, there are methodology sections of each year's report that do mention kind of a lot of these concerns as limitations to the approach for consideration when thinking about these results, that this is not a perfect comparison for a number of reasons, that being one of them.
Well, I appreciate you raising that. Are there other comments? Are we ready to move to public comment at this stage? I see a hand, but I'm unable to see where it's coming from. So I'm not sure if it's a member of the public. So if it is a member of the public, sit tight. Are there any other board members who had comments, concerns, questions to raise now? Great, and I thank you for raising those. So we're gonna let's move to the public comment portion of our meeting. It's extremely valuable part of our coming together. And so I'm wondering if someone from DOJ is able to see a sort of a hand raise function. I think I found something. I think I've opened up the correct window. So I'm going to ask those who are able to, who would like to comment, if you could toggle the raise hand if you're able to on Teams. And if you're not able to, then we'll come to a moment where I ask folks to unmute, for example, if they're on a phone and don't have a way to toggle that. Sometimes we sweep from north to south in the state, but at this moment, I just see one hand up so far. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Michelle Wittig, did you want to unmute and share comments?
Yes, thank you. Are you able to hear?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Yes, it's Michelle Wittig from the Santa Monica Coalition for Police Reform and a retired professor at Cal State Northridge. I have a request, a comment, and 3 questions. They are actually in the chat. If you could let us know when the 2022 stop data will be posted on the Open Justice website. And my comment is about the Police Officers Research Association critique of the 2022 RIPA annual report. I put the link to the Dropbox access to that report in the chat. The PORAC critique was authored by Professor Brian Withrow, and it includes several disagreements about the appropriate framework for assessing the meaning and implications of disparities. We've heard a couple of those already, I think, in the real-time comments of the commission this afternoon. It also includes what Dr. Withrow acknowledges is perhaps a misunderstanding due to the lack of sufficient information about some of the rationales for some of the decisions about data analyses. The third critique that I found includes what I would consider to be several valid claims about methodological weakness that have gone perhaps unacknowledged in the appendices. And the fourth one is several disagreements among statisticians about the valid interpretation of the data. So I have 3 questions. Has RIPA written a response to this published report? The second question is, in what ways, if any, did the 2023 RIPA annual report take those valid points from PORAC's critique into account when analyzing the data from 2021, keeping in mind that every annual report is 2 years behind the data? I ask these questions partly because you're writing the 2024 report and we want it to be the best it can be based on the 2022 data, which we've just heard about today. So what clarifications did the 2023 report make that responded to the critiques? And of course, what responses may you be planning for the 2024 report? I know that's a lot, but it's all in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do we have other comments from the public? So I'm going to open up my participant list again and see if there's anyone who wants to raise a hand to indicate they want to speak. And I'll keep an eye on that. I don't see any other hands now, but I'm going to move to, I don't know if there are folks who've called in via phone and have a way to unmute and wanted to share a comment. Is there anyone from the Northern California area? And is there anyone from Central California? If so, please feel free to unmute. And finally, I'll move to Southern California. Are there any participants from Southern California who'd like to unmute and weigh in? All right. And typically we don't respond in real time to public comment, but we take these comments in with great interest. But I did want to ask Kevin, since we have you here, can you remind me, I've asked before and I'll ask again, what the timeline is as data is posted to Open Justice? Do you know offhand, do you remember roughly what the timeline is for data being posted? So in this case, the 2022 data, let's say.
Yeah, so 2022 data is slated for publication on Open Justice at the time that coincides with the release of the board's report analyzing those data. That's been the same release schedule that past year's data publications have followed. I anticipate that that's what it will be this year as well. But the RIPA data can be obtained at any time through a Public Records Act request through an email to the department. So just because those data are not yet posted does not mean that they are not obtainable for anyone who would like access to them.
Great. Okay. Thank you. All right. And so just in terms of to clarify timelines, our most recent report was posted in January 2023. I think the PORAC report that was referenced was also released in January. So the current RIPA report would not have been in response to that, but I appreciate public comment referring to that. Is there anyone else from the public who had wanted to, has figured out now how to unmute or how to comment? I'll take one more moment. Okay, I hope I haven't missed anyone. I don't see any other hands. And so now we're at the last stage of our meeting, discussion of next steps. I want to remind board members we have a meeting of the entire board. I believe on the 28th, if that's correct. Someone from DOJ.
The 28th at 10 a.m.
Great. Are there other comments or suggestions for our next steps as a subcommittee at this time? All right, well, I want to thank everyone greatly for their participation. Thank you, especially DOJ, for really walking us through so much of what's going to come in the analysis for the next report and for the hard work you're doing. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone at the next full board meeting. And then we should expect to have another subcommittee meeting at some point a little bit later in the year, I believe, as we have more information as the report is coming into fuller view. Does anyone from DOJ have anything else they want to add at this time that we need to cover?
I just want to thank the subcommittee for all of the discussion. It's been very helpful for us. I've been taking a lot of notes to take back, and that'll inform our analyses moving forward. So thank you.
And Kevin, we thank you. Thank you, Marshall, also, especially for the presentations today. And thank you to all our fellow board members. And a special thank you to board member Bianco for running for co-chair. I congratulate you on your election to co-chair, and I look forward to working with you. All right, then I think we're great to see you. I think we're good for today. Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.